Brief introduction before I turn it over to our moderator, Professor Thayer. So welcome everyone on behalf of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies. I'm Sonia Alvarez, and I had been reluctant to call this kind of conversation for much of the semester, thinking I didn't want to be alarmist. And then things got increasingly alarming. And then as things were getting increasingly alarming, we had a little bit of a hard time getting our schedules together to be able to pull the five of us together. We didn't try a larger group. This is just a very informal conversation, drawing together some of the people who think about and talk about it and who are from Brazil on campus. We are hoping that out of this will grow some larger effort in the fall or even spring, perhaps a lecture series or a conference or whatever. We can all talk about it later. But the other thing I should say is that the reason for this particular format, which as you'll see is a roundtable discussion rather than a series of talks, is that it's a situation that's so confusing and confounding and complicated that it would be atrevido, it would be foolish in some ways for anyone to try to sort of, pontificate the full and complete account and truthful version of events and so on. So in lieu of that, we will each be foolish separately and together and try our hand at saying a few things about the current situation. So Millie, well, you want to introduce people? Sure.
Sure. And then I'll say something about the format. I'm not going to be foolish because I was so busy this semester. I knew I didn't know enough to set myself up as an expert on this, so I volunteered to moderate. And we have some excellent panelists. Sonia, you all know, director of CLACLS, the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies. Jorge Minella, who is a graduate student in the history department. Layla Carvalho, who is a Fulbright graduate exchange student, and Wolfe, who is a professor in the history department. So as Sonia said, we're all watching these events with angustia in our own, separate spheres, and wanted to have a chance to have a conversation to try and make some sense out of it. So the way we thought we would set this up is Jorge is going to start with a kind of a timeline of what has happened to kind of locate us all in the recent events. Then Joel is going to give us some historical context. And then we have a series of questions that everyone's will address one by one. It'll be up to each person whether they want to contribute to that particular question. And what else? There's always room for input from the audience. If you have a question or concern that comes up that you want to insert into the conversation, we welcome that as well.
Yeah, we don't need to wait for the Q&A. You can sort of chime right in if you have an insight into one of the questions or
or a follow-up question.
Or follow-up question.
Yeah. So let's start with Josh even.
Okay, so when we started talking about doing this roundtable, we thought it would be interesting to give a brief overview of what happened since the Workers' Party was elected in 2003. And I will talk very briefly about it. I know that many important things will be left out from this brief overview, but I'm sure they will appear later. One thing, are we calling Operation Lava Jato car wash?
Yes, yeah, sure.
Car wash? So, in 2002, as you know, Lula ran for the fourth time for the presidency. His campaign this time rejected radicalization and ruptures, focusing on reforms and on obtaining parliamentary support. Lula emphasized the importance of fighting hunger and extreme poverty. He was elected in the runoff with 61% of the votes, defeating José Serra from Fernando Henrique Cardoso's party. Lula's electoral coalition was relatively small. It had one of the major left-wing parties and three minor parties. His vice president was a textile industrialist. Lula's first 4 years in office focused on gaining the confidence of the markets with record high primary surpluses to debt payment and strict inflation control. In his first year, however, Lula's administration created the Bolsa Familia, a conditional cash transfer program to alleviate poverty. And this term also saw the enormous growth and economic success of Petrobras, the state-controlled oil company that also, in this term, discovered a huge reserve of oil in the Brazilian coast, and all of that has an impact on what is going on today. In 2005, also the first major corruption scandal of PT's government broke out. The Mensalão, famous Mensalão, was a scheme of monthly bribes to deputies of parties with small representativeness in the Congress. PT was buying support for new legislation. The scandal had a tremendous impact not only on the party but on the Brazilian left in general. And we will get to this discussion later. The opposition in that moment moved to impeach President Lula, but the president himself denied he knew about the scheme, and the process did not move forward. Despite the Mensalão crisis, Lula was re-elected in 2006, winning the runoff with 60% of the votes. With the economy seemingly on track, the commodities boomed, the markets placated the electoral success, again obtaining with a relatively small electoral coalition of 4 parties. His second term was marked by full employment, systematic increase of the minimum wage, the beginning of a popular housing program, and the lowering of interest rates. Moreover, and here's something that I think is really important, Lula's administration launched the Growth Acceleration Program, a major public works initiative to improve Brazilian infrastructure, predicting investments, both public and private, of around $300 billion in 4 years. During this period, the 4 main Brazilian construction companies today involved in car wash developed close ties with Lula's government. Also during this period, Lula sought to broaden the government's coalition. Early on, the Democratic Mobilization Party, the PMDB, officially joined the coalition. The party is formed by mostly local state elites, agribusiness representatives, and now people from the evangelic movement. As we know, today some of the key characters of Dilma's impeachment are her vice president Michel Temer and the lower house president Eduardo Cunha, both from the PMDB. Anyway, Lula left office with approval rates as high as 70 or 80%, but Dilma would suffer because of some of Lula's decisions and policies. In 2010, Dilma Rousseff, former Minister of Mines and Energy, with Lula's support and Temer as vice president, was elected with 56% of the votes. While Lula had been elected with an electoral coalition of 4 parties, Dilma had 10 parties with her. Following the alliances set up by Lula during his second term. Of those 10 parties, it is possible to say that just 2, the Brazilian Communist Party and the Democratic Labour Party, has shared some of the PT's programs. The other ones, not really. In June 2013, protests demanding improvements in the public transportation system that started in the city of São Paulo spread throughout the country. While it spread, its demands became more and more diverse and sometimes obscure, moving away from the events that had started it. Demands such as the ones of the housing movement, particularly concerned with the increase of evictions related to the constructions for the World Cup and the Olympics, or demands for better public services, were suffocated by a wave of middle and high-class protesters unhappy with the successive corruption scandals. In their view, however, corruption had one cause: PT's leftist government. It is important to highlight, I think, that Dilma's government came up with an interesting response to the protests. Political reform, a long-standing project of the PT and its social basis, came back to the agenda. Although vaguely draft, the government proposed to do a national plebiscite to reform the political system. The plebiscite would give the people opportunity to vote on many important issues, such as the end of anonymous votes by lawmakers and new rules for the financing of electoral campaigns. Even more important is to highlight that the plebiscite proposal was immediately rejected by Dilma's own allies within the PMDB, and her government backed out of the proposal quickly. Dilma ran for re-election again with 10 parties in the coalition. She won a very tight election with no more than 4% more votes than Aécio Neves. Her re-election campaign was marked by the beginning of the economic downturn, the first results of the car wash operation that was hitting Petrobras, and it's important to remember that she was part of the company's council, and she was Minister of Mines and Energy. And also in 2014 we had the World Cup. Since her re-election, Operation Car Wash has revealed more and more widespread corruption involving Petrobras' contracts and a number of other companies, as well as politicians within and outside the government's coalition who have received hundreds of millions of dollars diverted from the company. Recently, however, Operation Car Wash has been accused of focusing only on PT's corruption while neglecting most reports and evidence against politicians from other parties. The situation reached a flashpoint when a judge from the state of Paraná, Sérgio Moro, responsible for the investigations of Car Wash, released illegally obtained wiretapping recordings of President Dilma, former President Lula, and his attorneys' telephone conversations. To this day, neither Lula nor Dilma have been directly connected to the corruption investigation in Car Wash, although Lula is being accused of hiding property under other person's name. In the chaos generated during and after the week of the leaks of the illegal wiretapping recordings, that was in March, the lower house accepted the impeachment request based on Dilma's fiscal peddling. Is that the pedaladas fiscais?
Fiscal peddling.
That is basically the use of money from public banks to temporarily cover the national treasury's deficit. From the 65 representatives that voted in the first stage of the impeachment process, 40, both of the situation and opposition, received campaign donations from companies involved in Car Wash. 4 of them have been directly cited in the operation so far, and 36 already have some kind of problem with the Brazilian justice system, not necessarily related to Car Wash. The Commission approved the start of the impeachment process, and in April 17th, the lower house plenary voted yes for impeachment. All but 3 parties of Dilma's coalition voted yes. The process moved to the Senate, and that is where we are now. So that's the overview of. Okay.
That was great, Jorge. So in classic university fashion, the graduate student did a much better job than his advisor will do. Just a kind of totally random thoughts, but thinking about car wash. I'm a Wisconsin PhD, and the big chain of car washes all over the state is Octopus. Right? It's like, this is the new octopus, right? And then I was thinking about Breaking Bad, right, where he uses a car wash to launder his money. So I want to give just a little context in Brazilian history, and I won't begin in 1500. But I think that's what's really important to keep in mind about Brazilian democracy are kind of 2 things that are seemingly contradictory, but I think exist together well. And the first, I'm channeling another political scientist, a UMass undergrad, Tim Powers, who's at Oxford. He was here, and he spoke to my Brazil class a couple years ago, and someone was asking about, well, the newness of Brazilian democracy, and he said, well, no one ever said that in the 70s or 80s about Japan or Germany, right? That their democracies, when they were 30 years old, were considered mature democracies. And I think it's fair to say that Brazil's democracy is mature, and that as strange, and I think that's the best word to use for all this, as this is, it is actually operating through the rules, and we can all be aghast at the way people are using those rules and the extraordinary hypocrisy of them. But they are using the rules, and no tanks have been involved. The other thing that's important to understand about this now mature democracy is that there's still a kind of suddenness to it that I think really is playing out in these attempts to, and now seemingly successful attempt to impeach PT presidents. And to me, and a partisan liberal in the United States, when Tea Party members say that that we'll start impeaching Hillary the day she takes office, right? I mean that this is a conservative reaction to what? To new groups of people having real access to power. And I think that what's the statistic that I find the most instructive about the kind of suddenness of Brazilian democracy is, and this is me as a historian, is to think back to the last presidential election before the coup. So the 1960 presidential election in which Jânio Quadros won. And Jânio Quadros won the election with 5.6 million votes nationally. 5.6 million votes. In 1986, Mário Covas was elected to the Senate from one state, now admittedly the biggest state, but one state with 7.7 million votes. Now the Brazilian population had doubled, right? But still, what really was going on is that that illiterates now had the right to vote, and that the franchise was fundamentally altered in the aftermath of the Abertura. That the new democracy was going to be a democracy, and that the argument that people like I make is that Brazil was never a democracy before then. When you had so few people with the access to the vote, and particularly a system where the Senate rewards, underpopulated rural states where the vote is really narrow, that you can't say that before 1986, 89, whatever year you want to choose, that Brazil was anything that we would recognize as a democracy. And then within that, this issue of new groups is that there is the trope that turns on its head, geographically some stuff in the States, but of the kind of very poor Northeast, which is a region of color, even though there are plenty of people of color all over Brazil, and that the poor Northeast is filled with, what someone on Fox News would describe as a low information voter, right? Like poor people are dumb and they vote for stuff, as opposed to rich people who vote for stuff. This is the rich people who get more stuff. And so maybe they're smart. But and that trope even plays into the PT, right? That Lula is from the Northeast. And Lula is part of, the great migration of Brazil that begins with the building of the roads and, automobility and so forth. And that so much so that during either Lula's first or second election, and I reproduced this in my book, that an email went around Sao Paulo, and it was like, don't let them take this from us, and it's a map of Brazil, and the them is the northern part of Brazil, and the us begins, I guess, in Rio, and goes down to Rio Grande do Sul, past Paraná, and so forth, and Santa Catarina. So I think that the racial, class, regional component, and that the region is almost fictive in people's mind, because there are lots of Northeasterners all over the south of Brazil, is very much about this. And then I would add one more thing as a historian that I just can't get past about what's going on in Brazil today. And it's definitely just my bias in history. And that is the fundamental role, no matter what else we say about Brazil, of commodities, right? And that I just wonder if the price of oil were at $90 a barrel, and the price of soybeans were higher, and the Chinese economy were healthy, how many votes there would be for impeachment if the Brazilian economy were growing at 5.5% a year, right? I just don't think there'd be many votes for impeachment. And there are opportunistic people on the right who are using everything to dump the PT, to get rid of or dramatically limit the Bolsa. I get that. But I think that no matter how much Brazilians and people like me celebrate Brazilian industrialism and the role of industrial exports and the industrial sector, the fact of the matter is that every country in the Western Hemisphere, including the United States and Canada, is heavily dependent on commodity production and export. And when we talk to a Canadian about their economy, and commodity prices are the canary in the coal mine of the kind of secular recession coming, driven by China, whatever. I'm not going to explain that because I don't know it. But that is what's ailing Brazil, and I think we can go back and we have to re-examine the brilliance of Fernando Henrique Cardoso as well as the brilliance of Lula, because so much of the propping up of the real had to do with soybeans, right? And these kind of not illegal, but kind of unspoken of soybean shipments to prop up the currency. And when you could no longer do that, and you could no longer prop up the economy that would was a healthy economy, but one that was much more commodity dependent, much more classically Latin American, then the kind of broad support for democracy started to erode. And this is a very convenient set of affairs to then go after a government that, again, was very much seen as those people's government. Now, when the economy was booming and the Bolsa was leading to, people jumping into the middle class, people weren't as critical of it. But I think with the contraction, it's an easy target. So I'll leave it there. Leave it at that.
Okay, so we have a series of kind of clusters of questions, and we thought we'd start with a kind of broad question to the panelists. How would you characterize Brazil's current crisis or crises? Is it a systemic crisis, a more narrowly defined political crisis, a crisis of the left, or a series of crises in multiple arenas? Don't all speak at once.
Right, in turn, what, Layla, you think with that?
So I think that we live a very, like a magic realism moment in Brazil. And it's written by a very mediocre media in a broad sense. And this is like, every day we are like bombed with very different and very sad story involving conservatism, huge amounts of money. Every day they are bigger and bigger, and unscrupulous decision makers, very well planned cover-ups to crimes and electoral crimes and corruption crimes in different areas and made from by different actors. Double standards for oppositional parties and government corruption crimes. And then an example of that is that in the car wash operation, we have like this very clear scheme that was also spoken about fullness, that involves the PSDB, which is the main oppositional party, and this thing's not like in the news and it's not widely spoken, and something you have to consider then when you have like different types of I don't know, maybe Lula is the owner of that apartment, which probably he is, but this gains a broader attention than this very I scheme very well. I don't know, that had very specific engines working for a long time in a very in a big state in Brazil, and this has not the same amount of attention that other things have. And we have also unaware, or at least a very loud civil society right now. So it's like we are listening to the streets. It's like some people said that the giant is awakened, and I disagree with that because I study social movement. So I know that the giant never sleeps, actually. And it's like it's working all the time, all day and nights, and trying to make Brazil work in a better way. So I think it's like a systemic crisis, a crisis that has, at least I try to organize my ideas about it, and I think it has like at least 5 crises that are intertwined. So we have this political crisis that is very clear and is very, it's everywhere in the media, and it's related, I think, it's like Jorge gave us a very good sense of what's happening in Brazil for the, I don't know, past 13 years. But this one that we are living now, I think, starts in the 2014 elections. Like, you have this difficulty of, because the opposition does not accept the result of the elections. And since the day after the elections, the first day after the elections, they are trying to unauthorized Dilma in the presidency. So we start there. And then in 2015, you have like the presidency of Eduardo Cunha in the lower house of the legislature. And this is another problem because he's being able to, with his bomb agenda, would be a good translation for the pautas bomb, but it's like lots of measures that are trying to shaken the ideas of a possible austerity plan that the government tried to implement in 2015, that is like being day and day in and day after day in, day out, being like threatened by these bombs that the legislature is like trying to put together. And 2016 is like the high point of the crisis in terms of politically saying, at least seems to be. Thinking about the economic crisis, we have like something that Joel has started, this problem of the price of the commodities. And also something that's like undermining the ability of the government to like talk to social movements. That is a very important basis for the government, because at the same time that you have like this need of having popular support, we're trying to push like very harsh measures on diminishing the increasing the salary, the minimum salary, and different types of austerity measures that are not making the poor like happier, and it's like an assumption that we actually have this fiscal crisis and this fiscal problem that doesn't pass, and I think this is a problem both from the left and the right, because we don't question the consensus of Washington thing about the fiscal responsibility. And then we put like the poor when we have like problems, economic problems, to pay for this crisis, and this is a different problem that also the government has right now. And then I would put like three more crises on this. A media crisis.
Wait, Layla, since these are all dealt with in other questions now?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's stuff, you can,
We'll come back. We
we
could
can come back to some of
these.
these things because
So I'm just gonna, okay.
there's a media crisis, just name them, media crisis, what
Media
else?
crisis, a judiciary crisis, and a social crisis.
Okay, because these are all actors.
Yeah.
There's a long list of questions. that-
Right.
Um, yeah.
That was it? Okay. So, I don't have an answer for that. I have a couple of questions. I was thinking, so is the crisis systemic? And I'm sure that it is certainly related to the Brazilian political system based on presidential coalitions, right? And open list voting and a party scheme that is really weak, and it's based on a trade-off of government positions that weighs much disproportionately, much more than any kind of programmatic approximation between different parties. So, yes, it involves the political relations between the Congress and the presidency. It involves the judiciary and a not so clean fight against corruption. It involves political polarization on the streets, the mainstream media behaving explicitly like a political party, the economy going down, corruption everywhere, so everything is falling apart. So on the other hand, I was wondering that maybe it's not that a systemic crisis if we consider that the PT committed serious political mistakes too, and those are mistakes of choice, political choices. And I think that especially during Lula's second term and Dilma's first term, the party sought to create a very large presidential coalition, and that's okay. That's what you do in this kind of systems, right? But the mistake was not paying attention on what you are losing with those alliances, right? And most of that not having a backup to what happens when my alliances fail, and I have the social movements are not exactly with the party anymore. But so the question is why the political elite within the party committed such a mistake, and then I think that in a sense, perhaps the very success of the first 8 years of Lula's government helps to explain this mistake, in the sense that other parties felt attracted by this success, and that Lula and the party's elite also felt overconfident that they had a good margin of negotiation to bring those parties into the same boat. And I think this balance worked relatively well while the economy went good. And then we get to the commodities issue that Joe and Layla mentioned. When that breaks up, the deal is not sustainable anymore. So the question would be if, this very broad coalition was a political mistake, or was that a necessity? Or what were the other options? Or could the PT have relied on its social basis from the beginning as a form of social pressure for reforms? Or how would the markets have reacted to that? And I'm not saying that this because I think markets must be pleased, but because angry markets generate problems to real people also. And also the political elites, if today some nuts scream that down with communism, talking about Dilma, what would have they done against Lula if he called Putin to support tax reforms, for example? Or could Lula have used his unmatched popularity to press harder for tax, political, debt, and media reform, for example? And I don't know, I wanted to know what you think. So I think the crisis reveals the system's limitations and this social pact that reached a limit, and kind of a rupture point that maybe was in the elections of 2014, but Dilma got re-elected, and that was the surprise. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, all of the above. I jokingly said to Joel before we all sat down that, if this is recorded, it may be that all this passes and everything is fine in 6 months, and it's often, not to say that politics is entirely cyclical, but this could be something that does pass and is surpassed, although I do think in many ways we are presently at least at an impasse that I don't see a way out of. In terms of what will happen post Dilma's impeachment, which is very likely to happen. But to address myself specifically to the question at hand, I have a relatively brief answer. I think it's a very grave situation, actually. I think it's somber. It's not only sort of magical realism, but what one pundit in Brazil called surreal-politik. Realpolitik, surrealpolitik. The crisis is obviously not about impeachment, never has been just about impeachment. It's very much about political backlash. It's about class hatred, I think, class conflict, to use an old-fashioned term, about deep-seated resentment about the fact that the excluded have indeed gotten far more access to far many more things than they have historically in the last 16 years, or 14 years. And there's a great deal of hatred around access of black students to the universities, access of women to the presidency, the amount of misogyny that has been rained upon this woman. I mean, it's just remarkable to the extent where, I don't know, I had the misfortune of having been kind of hooked on watching a lot of the actual legislative proceedings online, and the opposition in the last phases had little, they were holding up little posters that said, "Ciao, querida, ciao, querida, ciao, sweetheart, bye, sweetheart." Like, can you imagine if it were a man? Would they ever be holding up "bye, querido" signs? I mean, that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the amount of sexism that was absolutely rampant. And then the most recent, and the feminists have had a great deal of fun with, that thing that happened is that, I was going to say Cama Franco, Michel Temer, who is the would-be self-proclaimed already president of Brazil, today president of Brazil because Dilma is in New York. He is married to a woman 43 years, his junior. Imagine if Dilma were married to a gatão 43 years her junior. But she is characterized in the same Veja that characterized Dilma as hysterical. Veja characterizes her as bela, recatada, e gular. Pretty, recatada means modest, demure, and of the home. So there have been hilarious memes on the feminist Facebook of or sort of slave women, working in the fields, or women drinking their butts off, bela recatada do bar, or whatever, endless, anyway. But even in the midst of deep crisis, Brazilians maintain a sense of humor. Anyway, I do think this is a very serious crisis that, because of the kind of political, I have not seen ever in my now 40 years of experience with Brazil since I was in my late teens. I have never seen this degree of political polarization and anger, ever. Perhaps those who witnessed or had occasion to see something of the, prior to the, it's more comparable to maybe, before the coup in Allende, or similar to what's going on in Venezuela. This is one of the things I've been talking about with my class in my Latin American politics undergraduate class. It's really comparable. I've never seen this kind of polarization where, family members can't speak to family members, neighbors to neighbors. It's beyond a crisis of institutionality, but it is also a crisis of democratic institutionality, a real impasse in a system that was long marked by weak parties and by what Scott Mainwaring and Tim Scully called a feckless democracy, a weak democracy. And a crisis also of the Workers' Party itself, which was supposed to be an exception to that rule, which was in this mess that was the Brazilian party system, was an ideological, programmatic, and disciplined party that tried the best it could to stay afloat in a sea of crooked, feckless folks, right? So it's a crisis of the Workers' Party, it's a crisis of its project of transformation, it's a crisis of a project of transformation of an entire political generation, arguably. So it's the end of a cycle for the Workers' Party. Even if Dilma persists, I can't see the Workers' Party continuing in its same form ever again. So in that sense, as people who are linked to the Workers' Party, many friends of mine in Brazil, including, see this as a really melancholic moment, that the PT should come to this, whatever this is, but that the PT should come to this, is part of what, to me, is most revealing about this crisis. Even if the political system recovers and so on, it's very unlikely that anything that we'll see anything like the PT develop in Brazil or anywhere else in Latin America for that matter for some time to come, because it was really, truly a remarkable party, not only for being programmatic and disciplined and ideological and so on, but also for being genuinely committed to giving, as they once said, institutional expression to social movements and being very committed to respecting movement autonomy. And so it's a model of social movement organizing that sadly we haven't seen emulated with much success anyway, elsewhere in the region.
So can I say, I thought that was great, Sonia, and everyone else. So there's a joke in this, which is, Tom Skidmore was invited on the first iteration of a show called Como Vamos a Ir da Crise in the 80s, and they had him back for the 10th anniversary of the show. And maybe crazy is the problem, right? But I guess listening to you, Sonia, what comes to mind is the whole, you can go back to Allende, is that how much reform can you do within a certain framework? And this was Jorge was saying, like, given what Lula was accused of, could you imagine if he'd gone to his base? And he did it very badly, Goulart. But I mean, Goulart tried that in the last months of his administration to kind of try to rally the population. Then you really are a communist to people if you dare bring these things up. So I'm going to take that depressing point and maybe make it a little bit less depressing and just say that I don't know that there are really structural impediments to the PT reconstituting itself and trying again, but maybe learning a lesson, and the lesson would be being a little bit more in touch with its base, right? And obviously there are always going to be limits to it, right? As long as this is the structure of capital and capital mobile and all that. But that maybe it is generational, and this is where it's the real limits of what I know, because I don't keep up at that level. But I don't know what's going on, on the state level. I don't know who is going to assert him or herself within the party. But there is also something really universal about this, right? So some of this corruption is related to building infrastructure, right? I mean, you can't, nothing was as corrupt as the United States when it built railroads in the 19th century. I mean, it's a fundamental part of that. But the other thing that I think is just so universal is, I've been joking for years that the right in this country will pivot from racism to misogyny in January of 2017, right? That we have the same narratives about Obama being a black man will become about Hillary being a woman. There's no question that's. And my final comment is, in the States I see it, but it's much stronger in Brazil, is the level of vitriol on the right is really inexplicable. And when you look at the left and you look at people who literally, were tortured, who are starved, who are beaten, and that their narratives of the right, of the elites, are not at the level of the narrative of the right about legal processes and elections, is just staggering to me. And it's a universal thing, it seems like. There's something about being really right-wing that's just nasty as hell.
Our next question was about the main factors, which we've already been talking about. So why don't we do a round where if people want to go back to something or bring up a factor in this crisis that hasn't already been mentioned, we can do that. Some of the sub-questions in this were the relationship between the economic downturn, and the crisis, which we talked about, the Lava Jato, and who are the key actors and how have they helped fuel or contain the climate of crisis? And this is getting a little more specific. Yeah.
I have a question that touches on the media crisis that Layla was talking about. So Veja, which is a newspaper that Professor Alvarez is talking about, that did the article about the man's wife, was founded in 1968, and Rede Globo, which is where people are mostly getting their news from, was founded in 1965, and was within a time period of the military dictatorship. So I think contextualizing the major media outlets in that way is helpful, but also then how can we think about their role in, you said that civil society, they're loud right now, and like what has been the media's role in amplifying that volume, and then also because I'm from Brazil and I have a lot of family who's there and are constantly sharing information, there have been a lot of criticisms of the lack of aerial views at some of these protests, because when there are aerial photos, it shows that the like for instance during the Congress votes and the protests that were right outside, when there was an aerial view, it showed that the people who were pro-impeachment were actually a smaller crowd than the people who were there in support of Juma. But the way that the media is framing this, it makes it seem like there are more people and they're a lot louder than perhaps they are. So just contextualizing these media outlets within the context of the dictatorship, and then also their role in sort of amplifying all of this, if you guys could talk about that too.
Yeah. What do you, well, I mean, I just want to say a couple things. One is that haven't been said. One is, this is the political scientist in me, is to stress the centrality of this system of presidentialism by coalition, which is a rather unique, I mean, presidentialism is, you know, there have been reams and much ink has been spilled about the dangers of presidentialism in Latin America and so on, so I won't go into that. But what's particularly problematic in Brazil is that because presidents have seldom, the party system is so fragmented, presidents are seldom elected with legislative, even pluralities, let alone majorities. So they've had to build these often ever more bizarre coalitions, and in the case of the PT, it got ever more bizarre, as Jorge rightly pointed out. And that's been part of kind of the structural problem, a structural problem that only a political, only a political reform, only a reform of the party system and the electoral system and so on could address. The only problem is that reform, of course, who would have to pass it would be the actual Congress that stands to benefit from it at present, unless it's done through plebiscite. And there was such a reaction to the idea of Dilma suggesting a plebiscite on this, for which there was wide support, that she had to back down in the midst of, at the beginning of the crisis, and right after the June 2013 protests. So anyway, presidentialism by coalition is one of the key factors in the crisis. The other thing is that the economic crisis, and this is I'm taking from an excellent article that Jeff Rubin recommended to us, and I would recommend to anybody, by Perry Anderson, just in the recent issue of London Review of Books, where he says, the country is indeed in a severe recession with GDP falling 3.7% last year, and probably much the same this year. Unemployment has yet to reach the levels of France, let alone Spain. Inflation is lower than in Cardoso's last year's, and reserves are higher. Public debt is half of that of Italy, though given Brazilian interest rates, the cost of serving is faster. The fiscal deficit is below the EU average. Still, so far, the depth of the economic hole does not match the volume of the ideological clamor about it. In other words, it's the ideological clamor about it that's the problem, and and much of the problem could be solved were it not for political polarization. In other words, the policy is at a deadlock, right? The woman can't pass, legislation about Band-Aids. I mean, she can't. Nothing can be passed. There's a complete, stalemate. It's not even a stalemate. Everything is at its complete stop. It's almost as if it were carnival. Brazil comes to a complete stop when it's carnival. Carnival never passed this year. It's still, so that's a major factor, I think. And it's so much the case that this is all political. I mean, the economy is political horrors, say the economists, that every time, there was a chance that the more of a chance there is that she will be impeached and Demo will come to power, the dollar goes down. The dollar goes down, interest rates improve, the economy improves every time there's
But this is Tammy's point, though, right?
Yeah.
That you have a media that's more than corporate in the United States, right? That
Yes.
Alberto Marinho is he's dead now, but he's a creation of the military.
Yeah.
And that he's very conservative, and so there isn't the space for talking about the economy in the way you just did, right? It is
Right.
kind of a snowballing effect,
Right.
and that's a real limiting factor in democracy. The other thing, when you talked about presidentialism, that came to mind, again, this is just not my field, I don't keep up, but when Dilma was named the candidate of the PT, it really felt like the PRI had named her the Tapada, right? I mean, it's just like, and it was just completely discontinent with a sense of democracy. It just felt like Mexico. And that you had the successful administration, and they controlled the levers of the state, and access to the oil company, I mean, the whole bit. And then, because that's how she came to power, she doesn't have the kind of political leverage and goodwill of a politician who had been, elected many times and done many things. And so that's part of, I think, Jorge's point about political mistakes.
Yeah.
May you want to speak to the media question? I I think I agree with you, and it's like, I can remember, I think like since the day that I start to read, I don't like reading. It's kind of problem. Since the day I started to read, I don't like vision. It's like it's very hard to read. But my point about this civil society being loud, even in terms of you have like different types of media that are trying to like address this crisis as well. And as you see these very it's like I think that they are like loud. This hashtag media, social media campaigns like the Belas de Catadas e do Lar, or the Isto é Machismo because of the Dilma hysterical point, or the debate about if the spite is worse than the torture thing. Like it's like several debates that are happening, and also this like all the manifestations and the protests that are questioning the role that global has, and sometimes a kind of trap to the global itself, because they are there and someone's like with a sign saying you are golpista, and so you have like more spread attempt of giving a different approach to what's happening. And I agree with you that Globo and Beja and Folha de São Paulo and Estadão have like a more broad audience, but I also think that despite the fact that internet's not available for everyone in Brazil, but Facebook's like people use a lot, and if you can produce this kind of debate in this kind of social media, it's like eventually you have like a different approach to the reality. So it's like it's a possibility. You have like different journals that you have Media Ninja that is everywhere, and you have these fronts of social movements that are trying to produce lots of content and like make this approach different. And also you have like attempts of boycotting global and all these more traditional means of media, and trying to like democratize news and the way you talk about Brazil. So it's like you have some movements, and also it's one of the strong criticisms to the government, the PT government. Like we didn't advance in this thing. We never talk about the need of having a different law to media and public concessions of TV and radio. It's like we have these families that are 5 families that rule our media for years and years. Today I read an article that was saying that Brazil is actually in the 104 position in a 110 index of media freedom. Not only because journalists are dying in Brazil a lot, but also because we have these 5 families that are like responsible for saying what's happening in Brazil. So we have this is a really big problem. But I think social media can do something like